The steam whistle cuts through Charleston Harbor's pre-dawn fog. A Confederate guard squints at the silhouette of the CSS Planter, a 150-foot armed transport steamer pulling away from Southern Wharf at 3:15 a.m. The captain stands on deck in his distinctive straw hat, one hand raised in casual salute. The sentries wave back, routine departure. Except the man in the straw hat isn't the captain. His skin is darker than any Confederate officer's should be. In the wheelhouse, 8 enslaved men and 5 terrified family members crouch below the gunwales, hearts hammering against ribs. They're piloting $150,000 worth of Confederate war machinery straight past 5 heavily armed forts, each one authorized to blow them out of the water on sight. One wrong signal, one suspicious movement, one guard who looks too closely, and 9 people will die in a hail of cannon fire before sunrise. This is May 13, 1862, and a 23-year-old slave named Robert Smalls is about to pull off the most audacious theft in American naval history. The question isn't whether he'll succeed. The question is, how do you steal a warship when the penalty for reading is death? Charleston, South Carolina, spring of 1862. The Confederacy is barely a year old, but its grip on the South is absolute. The city's harbor bristles with fortifications. Fort Sumter, where the war began with the first shots 13 months earlier, stands guard at the harbor mouth. Fort Moultrie commands the northern approach. Castle Pinckney watches the western channels. Fort Ripley and Fort Johnson complete the Ring of Iron. Between them, naval patrols sweep the waters day and night. No ship moves without authorization. No vessel leaves without proper signals. And absolutely no one questions the natural order of things, white men giving orders, black men following them. Robert Smalls was born into that order on April 5, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, 45 miles south of Charleston. His mother, Lydia, was enslaved in the house of Henry McKee. Robert never knew his father with certainty, though some whispered it was McKee himself. What he did know was bondage. The McKee household was considered relatively lenient by the standards of slavery, which is to say the violence was methodical rather than random. Lydia made sure her son understood the brutality that existed beyond their master's property. She deliberately took him to see slaves being whipped, sold, and beaten. Her message was clear: learn what you are in this world. At 12 years old, Robert was sent to Charleston to be hired out. McKee rented his labor to various employers, pocketing the wages while Robert received nothing but experience. He worked the docks, hauling cargo, loading ships, absorbing the rhythms of maritime commerce. He learned to read the tides, judge the weather, navigate by landmarks. He watched captains and pilots maneuver vessels through Charleston's tricky channels, noting the signals they used, the protocols they followed, the exact sequence of whistle blasts that meant safe passage. By his late teens, Robert had become a wheelman, one step below a pilot, steering ships under the direction of white officers. The irony was not lost on him. Confederate law prohibited enslaved people from learning to read or write, yet the Confederacy trusted him with the wheel of their war vessels. He could navigate ships worth thousands of dollars through narrow channels and treacherous currents, but legally he couldn't own a single dollar himself. In 1858, Robert married Hannah Jones, a hotel maid enslaved by a different owner. They had 2 children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr. Under South Carolina law, the children's status followed their mother's condition. They belonged to Hannah's owner, not to Robert or Hannah. At any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all, the children could be sold away to Louisiana, Mississippi, or Alabama, places where the mortality rate for enslaved children exceeded 50% before age 5. The fear of separation haunted every enslaved family in Charleston. It was not a question of if, but when. The war changed everything and nothing. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, Charleston erupted in celebration. Bonfires lit the streets, militia companies paraded in new gray uniforms, and the enslaved population watched, calculating what the conflict might mean for them. Some hoped for liberation. Others feared the tightening of chains. Robert Smalls saw an opportunity, though he didn't yet know its shape. In March 1861, he was assigned to the CSS Planter, a shallow-draft steamer built in 1860. The vessel measured 147 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a draft of just 4 feet that allowed it to navigate the coastal waterways and rivers of South Carolina. It wasn't a warship in the traditional sense. The Planter was designed as a cotton transport, but the Confederacy had converted it for military use. It now carried a 32-pound pivot gun forward and a 24-pound howitzer aft, both capable of reducing wooden fortifications to splinters. The Planter's mission was logistical support, transporting ammunition, troops, and supplies to Confederate installations along the coast. It also served as a dispatch vessel, carrying orders between forts and headquarters, This meant the planter had unrestricted access to Confederate positions and knowledge of defensive arrangements. Every signal code, every password, every protocol, Robert learned them all from the wheelhouse. The captain was Charles J. Rillier, a white officer who trusted Robert's seamanship enough to let him handle the vessel during routine operations. Rillier had a distinctive appearance, thin build, graying beard, and a straw hat he wore constantly, even indoors. From a distance, especially in fog or darkness, the hat became his identifier. Guards recognized the hat before they recognized the man. The crew of the planter consisted of 9 enslaved men. There was Alfred Goodine, Abraham Alston, Abraham Jackson, John Smalls, no relation to Robert, Samuel Smalls, also no relation, Gabriel Turner, William Morrison, and David Jones, Hannah's brother. 8 men plus Robert. They worked under white officers during the day but often stayed aboard at night when the vessel was docked. This was standard practice. Enslaved crew members were cheaper than paying for overnight guards. Robert began forming his plan in the fall of 1861. The idea came to him in pieces, not as a single revelation but as an accumulation of observations. He noticed that Confederate officers rarely came aboard before dawn. He noted that signal protocols remained consistent: 3 short whistles leaving the dock, 2 long blasts passing Fort Sumter, 1 extended whistle entering Union-controlled waters. He studied the guard rotations at each fort and learned which sentries were alert and which were habitually drowsy at 3 a.m. But a plan requires more than observation. It requires Confederates, and recruiting enslaved men to steal a Confederate warship was inviting betrayal. The Confederacy offered cash rewards for information about escape attempts. A single informant could doom them all. Robert needed men he trusted absolutely. He started with his brother-in-law, David Jones, then Alfred Goodine, who had worked the docks with Robert for years. Slowly, carefully, he brought the others in, one conversation at a time, feeling out their courage and commitment. Some historians question whether the plan was entirely Robert's conception. In 1862, literacy among enslaved people was rare, and operational planning of this complexity seems improbable for someone with no formal education. But this skepticism underestimates what enslaved people learned through observation and oral tradition. Robert had spent a decade studying navigation, memorizing routes, and absorbing the technical knowledge that white officers assumed was beyond black comprehension. He couldn't read charts, but he could read water. He couldn't write orders, but he knew every Confederate signal code by heart. His education came from watching, listening, and surviving. The crew debated the risks endlessly. Discovery meant death, not by trial but by immediate execution. The Confederacy did not waste time on legal proceedings for enslaved people who committed capital offenses. They would be hanged from the planter's yardarm as an example to others. Yet staying meant remaining enslaved, watching their children grow up in bondage, facing the constant threat of being sold south. The question wasn't whether escape was dangerous. The question was whether the danger of staying exceeded the danger of running. By April 1862, Robert had refined the plan to its final form. They would wait for a night when the white officers left the ship to sleep ashore, something that happened occasionally but unpredictably. The crew would remain aboard as usual. Once the officers were gone, they would fire the boilers, take on their families from a prearranged location, and sail the planter straight out of Charleston Harbor. They would pass the forts using proper signals, with Robert wearing Captain Relier's straw hat and standing on deck in the captain's usual posture, arm raised in casual salute. If challenged, Robert would respond with the correct passwords. If that failed, they would run for the Union blockade at full steam and hope the Union Navy didn't sink them before they could surrender. The plan required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and luck, lots of luck. It also required answering one question the crew debated long into the night: what about their families? If they escaped without their wives and children, the Confederacy would take brutal revenge on those left behind. But taking families meant more people to keep quiet, more mouths to feed, more bodies to hide if something went wrong. Robert insisted the families had to come. They would succeed together or die together. On the evening of May 12, 1862, Captain Rellier and the 2 white officers, pilot Samuel Pitcher and engineer Samuel Z. Kisham, left the planter docked at Southern Wharf in Charleston. They had been transporting artillery and ammunition to James Island all day and were exhausted. Rellier told Robert the crew could remain aboard. He would return in the morning. Then he and the officers walked off the ship to spend the night at their homes. The moment they disappeared into the Charleston streets, Robert knew this was the night. At approximately 11:00 p.m., Robert gathered the crew in the wheelhouse. Some accounts suggest he gave a speech, something about freedom or death. Other accounts say he simply asked each man if he was ready, and each man nodded. What is certain is that they began firing the boilers, building steam pressure slowly to avoid attracting attention. The planter typically made noise at night during maintenance, so the hiss of steam and clang of metal wouldn't raise alarms immediately. While the boilers heated, Robert dispatched Gabriel Turner and Abraham Jackson to fetch the families. They took a small rowboat and slipped through the darkness to the designated pickup point near the waterfront, several blocks from Southern Wharf. Hannah was waiting with Elizabeth and Robert Jr. Also present were Alfred Gooding's wife and child, Abraham Olstan's family, and several others. In total, 5 women and 3 children. Turner and Jackson made 2 trips, rowing them silently back to the planter and hiding them below deck in the cargo hold. The women clutched their children's mouths to keep them from crying. One sound, one nervous shout, and guards would come running. By 3:00 a.m. on May 13th, the planter was ready. Steam pressure was optimal. The crew was positioned. Robert put on Captain Relier's straw hat, which he had taken from the captain's cabin, and his long coat, which hung nearly to the deck on Robert's shorter frame. He practiced standing the way Relier stood, one arm cocked at the hip, the other raised in greeting. In the dark, from a distance, the silhouette had to be convincing. At 3:15 a.m., Robert gave the order. The crew cast off the mooring lines and the planter pulled away from Southern Wharf. The steam engine thumped steadily. The paddle wheels churned. The vessel moved at a deliberate, unhurried pace. Routine departure, nothing suspicious. The first test came immediately. A Confederate guard stationed at the wharf watched them leave. He saw the captain on deck, saw the raised hand, heard the proper whistle signal. He waved back. The planter continued into the harbor. They steamed slowly through the inner harbor, passing Castle Pinckney on their left. The fort's sentries were visible on the ramparts, silhouetted against lanterns. Robert kept his face angled away, his posture mimicking Relier's slouch. The crew stayed below deck or out of sight. From a distance, everything appeared normal. Next came Fort Ripley. The planter had to pass close to the fortification to stay in the navigable channel. Robert gave 3 short blasts on the whistle. The signal meant Confederate vessel on routine business. The sentries acknowledged with a lantern signal. They were clear. Fort Johnson loomed ahead. This was the most dangerous moment so far. The fort's commander, Brigadier General Roswell Ripley, was known for his paranoia and attention to detail. His guards were drilled to check every vessel, even familiar ones. The planter slowed slightly, giving the appearance of deference. Robert sounded the whistle again, 2 long blasts, the meaning requesting permission to proceed. A lantern on the fort's walls flashed green. Permission granted. The planter steamed on. Now they approached Fort Sumter, the most heavily armed installation in the harbor and the site where the war had begun. The fort mounted more than 135 guns and was garrisoned by several hundred soldiers. Its commander, Colonel Alfred Rhett, was a veteran of the bombardment that had forced the Union to surrender Sumter in April 1861. He tolerated no breaches of protocol. The standing orders at Fort Sumter were explicit. Any vessel leaving Charleston Harbor after dark must give the proper signal and reduce speed for inspection. Failure to comply meant immediate cannon fire. Robert had studied these orders countless times from the wheelhouse. He knew exactly what to do. The planter approached Sumter slowly, throttling back to near-idle speed. Robert stood on deck, fully visible in the faint moonlight, arm raised. He wore the straw hat, the coat, and maintained Relier's posture. He sounded the whistle, 2 long blasts, a pause, then 1 short blast. This was the signal the planter used when transporting dispatches indicating official vessel, do not delay. On the ramparts, a sentry saw the familiar silhouette. He saw the straw hat. He heard the correct signal. He checked his pocket watch, 4:00 a.m., early but not unprecedented. The planter often ran dispatch missions before dawn. The sentry signaled with his lantern, proceed. The most dangerous 200 yards of Robert Small's life began. Fort Sumter's guns could reduce the planter to driftwood in seconds. 1 suspicious guard, 1 officer who looked too closely, 1 random inspection, and it was over. The vessel crept past the fort at 3 knots, paddle wheels turning slowly, steam exhaust barely visible in the fog. Every man aboard held his breath. The women in the hold clutched their children. Time stretched. Then they were past. Fort Sumter fell behind them. The open Atlantic lay ahead. Robert kept the speed low, kept the whistle silent, maintained the charade for another half-mile until the fort was out of clear visual range. Only then did he throttle up to full speed. The Confederate Navy was behind them. The Union Navy was ahead, and neither knew they were coming. The Union blockade of Charleston consisted of a squadron of warships positioned approximately 3 miles offshore, forming a loose arc from north to south. The flagship was the USS Onward, a 974-ton steam gunboat mounting 10 guns. It was commanded by Captain John Frederick Nichols, a naval officer who had spent the past year stopping Confederate blockade runners. His orders were straightforward: sink any vessel that attempts to leave Charleston without authorization. No warnings, no negotiations. As dawn broke around 4:30 a.m., the USS Onward's lookout spotted a vessel approaching from the direction of Charleston. It was flying the Confederate flag. It was a known Confederate dispatch vessel, and it was heading straight toward the Union squadron at speed. Captain Nichols ordered battle stations. Gun crews loaded their cannons. Marines grabbed their rifles. The Onward's powerful 11-inch Dahlgren gun, capable of punching through 2 feet of oak at close range, swung toward the approaching target. The order to fire was seconds away. On the Planter, Robert saw the Union warship's guns training on them. He knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the Onward opened fire. He screamed at Alfred Gooding, who was manning the Confederate flag. "Haul it down now." Gooding tore the Confederate banner from the mast. Beneath it, they had hidden a white bedsheet taken from the captain's cabin. It snapped open in the morning wind, the universal signal of surrender. On the Onward, the gunnery officer's hand froze on the firing lanyard. "Sir, they're striking their colors." Captain Nichols raised his telescope. He saw the white flag. He saw black men on deck waving. He saw women and children emerging from below. He gave the order to hold fire. The Planter came alongside the Onward at approximately 5:00 a.m. Robert Smalls stepped to the rail, still wearing Captain Relier's straw hat, and called out the words he had rehearsed in his mind for months. "I have the honor, sir, to present you with this vessel, the Confederate steamer Planter, as a token of good faith. I am delivering her, her guns, and her cargo to the United States Navy." Captain Nichols was stunned. He had been prepared for combat, not surrender, certainly not this. "Who are you?" he called back. "I am Robert Smalls, sir. These are my crew and our families. We have escaped from Charleston with the Confederate transport Planter. She is yours if you will have us." Nichols ordered the vessels lashed together. He sent a boarding party across. They found 9 enslaved men, 5 women, and 3 children. They found a ship loaded with 4 artillery pieces, several thousand rounds of ammunition, a cargo of rifles, and 200 pounds of gunpowder. They also found maps, code books, and dispatches detailing Confederate defensive positions throughout Charleston Harbor. The intelligence value alone was staggering. Robert handed over the ship's papers, explaining in detail what they had done. He described the route out of Charleston, the signal codes, the timing of guard changes at each fort. He offered to guide Union vessels back into the harbor if they wanted to attack. Nichols listened, occasionally glancing at his officers in disbelief. This kind of prize, this kind of intelligence didn't just fall into your lap, yet here it was. Within hours, Robert Smalls became a sensation. The USS Onward transported the Planter and its passengers to Port Royal, South Carolina, where Union forces had established a base after capturing the area in November 1861. When they arrived, word spread instantly. A group of enslaved people had stolen a Confederate warship and delivered it to the Union Navy. Reporters swarmed. Northern newspapers picked up the story within days. "The smartest contraband of the war," declared the Philadelphia Press. "A slave's heroism," announced the New York Tribune. The Union Navy had a problem. Under the Fugitive Slave Act still technically in force, escaped slaves were supposed to be returned to their owners. But these weren't just escaped slaves. They had brought military assets worth an estimated $150,000, provided critical intelligence, and demonstrated skills the Navy desperately needed. The solution came from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who authorized payment of prize money for the captured vessel. Normally, prize money was split among the crew of the ship that made the capture. In this case, the crew was Robert Smalls and his men. The exact amount became a matter of political calculation. Some congressmen argued for the full value of the vessel. Others worried about setting a precedent that might encourage more slaves to steal Confederate property, which could anger border states still loyal to the Union. The compromise was $1,500, less than 1% of the ship's value, split among the crew and families. Robert received $450, a fortune for a man who had never legally owned a dollar, but a pittance compared to what white naval officers would have received for the same act. Still, money was the least of what they gained. They had their freedom. The women and children were safe. And Robert Smalls had become a symbol of black agency and intelligence at a time when the Union was debating whether to allow black men to fight. The Confederate reaction was predictable and furious. Charleston newspapers demanded the execution of Robert Smalls and his crew in absentia. The owners of the enslaved men filed legal claims seeking compensation for lost property. Captain Relier faced a court of inquiry investigating how he could have allowed 9 enslaved men to steal his ship. Relier's defense was that he had trusted his crew, that Robert Smalls was an experienced wheelman, that the theft was unforeseeable. The court found him negligent but not criminally responsible. He was quietly reassigned to administrative duties and never captained another vessel. The Confederate Navy also changed its protocols. No enslaved crew members could remain aboard vessels overnight without white supervision. Signal codes were altered. Guard rotations at forts were intensified, but these changes came too late. The damage was done both materially and psychologically. If a slave could steal a warship from under the Confederacy's nose, what did that say about Confederate security? What did it say about the assumptions of white supremacy that undergirded the entire Southern social order? Robert Smalls didn't stop with the Planter. The Union Navy hired him as a pilot, initially on transport vessels, then later as pilot of the USS Planter, his old ship, now repurposed for Union service. He guided Union forces through the treacherous waterways of South Carolina, using his intimate knowledge of the coastline to support amphibious operations. On December 1, 1863, while serving as pilot on the USS Planter during an engagement near Secessionville, South Carolina, the ship came under heavy Confederate artillery fire. The white captain panicked and ordered the vessel to retreat directly into a minefield. Robert, at the wheel, refused to follow the order. He recognized that the captain's command would sink the ship and kill everyone aboard. Instead, he steered through a narrow channel he knew was clear, bringing the Planter out of danger. For this act, he was officially promoted to captain, becoming one of the first black men to command a United States naval vessel. He served throughout the war, participating in 17 engagements. He was present at the 1863 assault on Fort Sumter, piloting a Union vessel past the same guns that had failed to stop him the previous year. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. After the war ended in 1865, Robert Smalls returned to Beaufort, South Carolina. He purchased his former master's house, the McKee property where he had been born enslaved. He turned it into a boarding house and offered rooms to his former master's widow when she fell on hard times, showing a generosity his former owners had never shown him. He entered politics during Reconstruction, serving in the South Carolina House of Representatives and then the state Senate. In 1875, he was elected to the United States Congress, representing South Carolina's 5th District. He served 5 terms, advocating for public education, equal rights, and economic development in the South. He fought against the rising tide of Jim Crow laws and the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters, though ultimately he could not stop the rollback of Reconstruction's gains. Robert Smalls lived to see the Confederacy defeated, slavery abolished, and black Americans granted citizenship and voting rights. He also lived to see many of those rights systematically stripped away through violence, intimidation, and discriminatory legislation. He died on February 23, 1915, at age 75 in the same house where he had been born enslaved. The Planter served the Union Navy until the end of the war, after which it was sold to private owners and eventually scrapped in 1876. No museum preserved it. No monument marked its significance. The ship that had been the vehicle for one of the Civil War's most audacious acts simply disappeared into history. What Robert Smalls proved in Charleston Harbor that May morning in 1862 was something white America desperately wanted to deny, that enslaved people were not the childlike, incapable beings that slavery's defenders claimed them to be. They were men and women of intelligence, courage, and capacity, trapped in a system designed to crush those very qualities. Robert had taught himself navigation by observation. He learned military protocols without access to manuals. He planned and executed a complex operation that required technical skill, strategic thinking, and nerves of steel. He did all of this while living under the constant threat of death, not just from the escape itself, but from the daily violence of slavery. The theft of the Planter was not just an escape, it was a refutation. It was proof, delivered in the form of a 150-foot warship, that the entire ideology of slavery was built on a lie. If a slave could outsmart an entire Confederate Navy, if he could pilot a stolen vessel past 5 armed forts, if he could navigate by stars and tides in memory while white officers slept comfortably in their beds, then what exactly were masters superior at? What did their authority rest on, other than violence? The cameras didn't exist in 1862 to document Robert Smalls' journey through Charleston Harbor. There are no 600 hours of surveillance footage, no biometric scans, no digital forensics. What exists is testimony, ship logs, naval records, and the stubborn fact of the Planter's arrival in Union hands. The Confederate guards who waved at a man in a straw hat never recorded their mistake. The sentries at Fort Sumter who let the vessel pass likely never admitted their failure. History is written by those who survived to tell it, and Robert Smalls survived to tell his. The ship's whistle faded into morning fog, the paddle wheels stopped churning, the steam engine cooled, and somewhere in the wheelhouse a straw hat was carefully set aside, no longer a disguise but a trophy, proof that the impossible could be accomplished by those whom society insisted were incapable of anything at all. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover history's most incredible acts of courage and cunning. Drop a like if you appreciate the depth we bring to these forgotten stories. And here's a question for the comments. Do acts like Robert Smalls' theft of the Planter represent individual heroism, or do they expose the fundamental fragility of systems built on oppression? Let's hear your take. See you in the next one.